At 20:17 a.m., the first call came in as a routine assault. By 10:24 a.m., dispatch upgraded it to attempted homicide. By 3:02 a.m., Detective Rachel Monroe was standing beneath the fractured glow of a broken rail yard floodlight, staring at a crime scene that felt staged. Not chaotic, not rushed, but arranged. The victim, male, 36, was found 30 yards from the old switching tower off Freight Line Road. Severe blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Defensive wounds along the forearms. Wallet untouched. Phone smashed, but still present. No vehicle theft. No robbery indicators. Someone wanted him hurt, not robbed, not silenced. Hurt. If you follow crime investigations where the smallest overlooked detail becomes the hinge that turns an entire case, stay with this one. Because what was discovered in the gravel beside the tracks would reframe everything. The rail yard had been decommissioned decades ago. Rusted tracks split into dead ends. Signal lights frozen permanently red. The switching tower, 4 stories of concrete and shattered windows, stood like a decaying sentry over nothing. Officer Patel briefed her quickly. Security guard found him. Patrols the storage warehouse's east side. Victim was conscious for maybe 30 seconds. Kept repeating one word. What word? Monroe asked. Signal. Monroe didn't react outwardly, but she filed it immediately. Signal. The paramedics had already transported the victim. Blood spatter pattern suggested he'd been struck from behind while walking northbound along the gravel access road. No drag marks. No secondary struggle zone. Monroe crouched near the impact site. There, embedded in damp gravel, a partial boot impression. Deep heel, narrow toe. Not work boots, not standard warehouse footwear. The tread pattern showed a distinct triangular notch near the arch. Intentional stance. Stable footing. One clean strike. She stood and scanned the environment. The switching tower's upper windows were dark, but one frame hung open slightly, swaying with the wind. Anyone clear that structure? She asked. Negative. Structural's unstable. She didn't like that answer. Rail yards are transitional spaces. People pass through them unnoticed. Transients, metal scavengers, urban explorers. But this felt different. There were no random footprints, no discarded bottles, no campfire residue. Too clean. Crime scene techs bagged a small metallic fragment found 6 feet from the victim's head. Not a bullet. Not shrapnel. Industrial. Possibly from a tool. Monroe stepped toward the switching tower entrance. The metal door was chained but not locked. The chain looked recently handled. Cleaner than the surrounding rust. She photographed it herself. Inside, dust layered the concrete floors, except for one narrow path of disturbance leading to the stairwell. Someone had been here, not frequently, but recently. She climbed carefully. 2nd floor, empty relay panels stripped of wiring. 3rd floor, broken glass, pigeon nests. 4th floor, cleat line across the entire rail yard. From here, she could see exactly where the victim fell. Direct line of sight. On the windowsill lay something that didn't belong, a portable radio scanner. Battery removed. Antenna extended. Monroe didn't touch it. Instead, she looked outward. The yard was quiet now. The yard was earlier. Someone may have been listening. Listening for patrol frequencies. Listening for movement. Listening for opportunity. Back at headquarters, preliminary victim ID confirmed. Daniel Hargrove, civil engineer. No record. No known enemies. Married. 1 daughter. Phone records showed he had no reason to be near Freight Line Road, except one. At 1:52 a.m., his GPS placed him at an address 2 miles south, an industrial supplier warehouse that closed at 6 p.m. He received a call at 1:49 a.m., unknown number, 38 seconds duration. 3 minutes later, he was driving north toward the rail yard. The call was placed from a prepaid device. Monroe requested the audio retrieval from Hargrove's voicemail system. If the call wasn't answered, maybe a message existed. It didn't, which meant he answered. Voluntarily. Security camera canvas along adjacent roads revealed something subtle but critical: a dark sedan trailing Hargrove's vehicle for at least 4 intersections. Not aggressively. Just far enough back to avoid suspicion. Plate unreadable. Headlights standard halogen, not LE. Older model vehicle. Deliberate. By 10:00 a.m., the victim was out of surgery but unconscious. Skull fracture. Significant hemorrhaging. Prognosis uncertain. And then the second call came in. 2:43 p.m., Another assault. Different victim. Same rail yard perimeter. This time, the victim was female, early 40s, struck near Warehouse C, less than 600 meters from the switching tower. Wallet intact. Phone destroyed. One word spoken before losing consciousness. Red. Monroe returned to the tower before sunset. 2 victims in less than 12 hours. Same geographic anchor point. No theft. No sexual assault indicators. No personal link between victims. At least not yet. She stood again on the 4th floor. Signal. Red. She turned slowly toward the frozen rail signals scattered along the yard, every one of them permanently red. She checked the scanner on the sill. Still no battery. But beneath it, etched faintly into the dust, were 2 letters. DH, initials matching the first victim, not scratched randomly. Written intentionally. A message. Or a signature. Monroe's phone vibrated. 3rd victim. Alive. Same area. Different time window. This one managed to describe the attacker before collapsing. Reflective vest. Like construction. That detail shifted everything. Because construction workers belong in industrial zones. They don't stand out. They blend in. And if someone wanted to control movement inside a dead rail yard, a reflective vest would be the perfect camouflage. Monroe stared again at the silent signals. Red means stop. But in abandoned systems, red means nothing. Unless someone decides it still does. By nightfall, patrol units established a perimeter. Drone sweep scheduled. Thermal scan requested for the tower interior and surrounding warehouses. Monroe remained at the base of the structure as the sky darkened. 3 attacks. 12 hours. No robbery. No direct link between victims. Only location. And words. Signal. Red. She replayed them in sequence. Signal red. Railroad terminology. Stop signal. Or warning. Her phone buzzed again. Forensics had tracked the metallic fragment recovered at Scene 1. Preliminary ID custom, machined steel alloy. Commonly used in signal maintenance tools. Rail infrastructure repair kits. Which raised a question no one in the department wanted to answer yet. What if the attacker wasn't choosing the rail yard randomly? What if the rail yard was the system, and the victims were being selected according to rules no one else understood? At 9:12 p.m., thermal imaging detected heat signature movement inside Warehouse C. Units approached silently. Monroe positioned at the rear exit. The warehouse door creaked open. A figure stepped out, reflective vest catching the floodlight. Hands empty. Walking calmly. As if nothing had happened. Police! Monroe called out. The figure froze, then ran, not toward the streets, but back toward the switching tower. Toward elevation. Toward control. Monroe gave chase. Up the stairs. 2 steps at a time. The 4th floor door slammed. She reached it seconds later. Inside, the scanner was back on the sill. Powered. Crackling softly. Police frequencies echoing into the night. The figure stood by the window, silhouetted. And then, without speaking, they knocked one of the old signal levers mounted as decoration beside the wall. It fell, crashing to the floor, a relic from a system long dead. Except this killer didn't think it was dead at all. To them, the signal still mattered. And tonight, they had just turned 1 green. The suspect didn't jump. That was Monroe's first realization. From the 4th floor window of the abandoned switching tower, there was enough drop to break bone, maybe worse. But instead of climbing out or surrendering, the figure stepped backward into shadow. Calculated. Not panicked. Monroe advanced slowly, weapon steady but lowered. Hands where I can see them. Silence. Except for the static hum of the scanner. The reflective vest glowed faintly in the floodlight bleeding through shattered glass. The suspect's face remained obscured beneath a dark cap and the angle of shadow. Turn around. The figure complied. Male, mid-40s, lean build, no visible weapon. Calm eyes gremlin. Not fear. Assessment. 2 uniformed officers reached the landing behind Monroe. The suspect raised his hands without resistance. No struggle. No denial. Only 1 sentence. You're early. Monroe cuffed him herself. Name. No response. She repeated it. He smiled, feinted it. Signals change when they're supposed to. He refused further identification. No wallet. No ID. No phone. In his vest pocket, a small rail key. The kind used to access maintenance control boxes along active tracks. Also recovered a compact metal tool kit. 1 slot empty. Forensics later confirmed that the missing slot matched the alloy fragment found at the first assault scene. The suspect remained silent during transport. At headquarters, fingerprint scan returned a match within 18 minutes. Ivan Kessler, age 46, former rail signal technician, employed with North Valley Transit Authority from 2001 to 2014, terminated following internal investigation. Monroe pulled the old employment file. Kessler had specialized in signal calibration and switching systems. His disciplinary record began 5 years into employment, complaints of obsessive procedural disputes, repeated conflicts with supervisors regarding protocol violations. Then came the incident, 2014. Freight Line Road Corridor. A freight derailment occurred after a signal malfunction. No fatalities, but 3 workers were seriously injured. Investigation concluded faulty wiring and delayed maintenance contributed. Kessler had filed 3 written warnings about that specific signal node in the months prior. Supervisors documented his reports as excessive and alarmist. After the derailment, internal politics shifted blame. Kessler was suspended pending review. 2 weeks later, he was terminated for insubordination and procedural non-compliance. Monroe studied the map attached to the old case file. The derailment site, exactly 0.8 miles north of the abandoned switching tower. The same yard now hosting the assaults. The victims' names ran through her system. Daniel Hargrove, civil engineer. Second victim Melissa Grant, logistics consultant for industrial shipping companies. Third victim, Arthur Pike, city planning subcommittee member. Monroe froze. City planning. She pulled archive minutes from 2013-2014 zoning and infrastructure meetings. Freight line road redevelopment proposals. Signal maintenance budget reductions. Warehouse rezoning. Private contract bids. Daniel Hargrove had testified as an engineering consultant on infrastructure cost reduction. Melissa Grant's firm secured a logistics optimization contract following the derailment. Arthur Pike voted on redevelopment measures. Each name surfaced within 6 months of Kessler's termination. Not random, connected by policy, connected by infrastructure decisions, connected by the signal failure. Monroe entered interrogation room 3. Kessler sat upright, hands folded, reflective vest removed, standard holding attire issued. You attacked 3 people. Monroe began. No. Kessler replied evenly. I corrected timing. Corrected timing. Red means stop. It always meant stop. You fractured skulls. They ignored warnings. His tone carried no anger, only conviction. Monroe placed printed meeting transcripts on the table. You believe these people are responsible for what happened in 2014. They voted to ignore safety. You were fired for insubordination. I was fired for being right. Silence lingered. Monroe leaned forward slightly. The derailment didn't kill anyone. Kessler's jaw tightened for the first time. It should have. She didn't respond. He continued. It should have killed someone important enough to matter. There it was. Monroe recognized the shift. The event had not delivered the consequence he believed necessary, so he manufactured one. You tracked them, she said. Followed them. Waited. I watched patterns? He corrected. People who move systems without understanding them. Why now? Kessler's eyes drifted upward, as if watching an invisible signal change. Because they're trying to reopen the corridor. Monroe paused. That was new. She confirmed quickly with infrastructure records. A private development proposal had been submitted 3 weeks ago to reactivate portions of Freight Line Road for commercial freight expansion. Budget committee meetings scheduled next month. Several advisory consultants listed, including Hargrove's firm. The pattern wasn't retrospective revenge. It was preventative. Kessler believed another disaster was imminent, and in his mind, assault was a warning system. Signal red. Monroe said quietly. He nodded once. They were proceeding without clearance. You don't get to decide clearance. That's exactly the problem. His emotional register never spiked. No rage. No thrill. No visible remorse. Just order. Structured thinking. Monroe stepped out and requested psychiatric evaluation protocol. But something unsettled her. Kessler had been apprehended too easily. He ran, yes, but toward the tower of visibility, toward interception, almost as if arrest was acceptable. as if the arrest was part of the sequence. She returned to the evidence board. 3 assaults. 3 connected individuals, all linked to infrastructure oversight. She checked Kessler's home address. Small rented house 20 minutes east. Utilities current. No prior arrests. Search warrant executed at 11:40 p.m. Inside, officers found detailed maps of rail systems. Not just Freight Line Road, but multiple inactive corridors across the state. Red circles marked at specific signal nodes. Dates written beside several. Future dates. Monroe's pulse slowed deliberately. This wasn't localized grievance. This was a timetable. Back at headquarters, Kessler requested to speak again. Alone. Monroe entered. "You found them," he said. "The maps." He nodded. "You're planning additional attacks." "I'm planning maintenance." "On who?" "Whoever refuses to stop." "Stop what?" "Restarting broken systems." Monroe studied him carefully. "You think violence is a maintenance tool?" He considered that. "Correction tool." She placed one of the maps in front of him. "Why mark inactive lines outside this city?" He looked genuinely surprised. "Because they're next." "Next what?" He leaned back slightly. "Did you think Freight Line was the only corridor they underfunded?" The pronoun struck her. "They plural." "Who is they?" she asked. He smiled faintly again. "The committee." "What committee?" But he said nothing further. Monroe left the room unsettled, because infrastructure projects did have oversight committees, state-level, multi-jurisdictional. But Kessler's language suggested something broader, almost conspiratorial. Yet his victim selection so far had been surgically precise. All publicly documented participants in infrastructure cost reduction debates. She cross-referenced his red, circled names with upcoming meeting attendee lists. 2 overlaps surfaced. 1 local transportation board member, 1 state procurement auditor scheduled to visit next week, both associated with dormant rail reactivation studies. If Kessler was following a progression, the next assault would occur before that meeting. She ordered protective detail immediately. At 2:03 a.m., while drafting containment strategy, Monroe's desk phone rang. Internal line. "Evidence processing." "Detective, you need to see this." She entered the lab. The portable scanner recovered from the switching tower had been powered up in a controlled environment. When forensic techs accessed its internal memory chip, they found recorded audio files. Police frequencies. Time stamped. Not just from tonight. From 6 previous nights over the past month. Kessler had been rehearsing, mapping patrol timing, learning response intervals. But that wasn't what stopped Monroe cold. 1 audio file, dated 3 days prior, captured a different voice. Not Kessler's. Male, unidentified, calm, saying one phrase, "Wait for green." Monroe stared at the waveform display. The tech rewound it. Played it again. "Wait for green." The voice wasn't distorted. Clear, close to the microphone, as if standing beside the scanner. Which meant one thing. Kessler hadn't been alone in the tower. And if someone else understood the signal sequence, then arresting Kessler may not have stopped anything. Monroe looked back toward The call came in fragmented. Mail down, construction area, bleeding suspect fled. Monroe was already in the car before dispatch finished the coordinates. Not Freight Line Road. Not the abandoned switching tower. This was Harbor Spur Extension, an inactive branch line slated for structural review next quarter. 2 miles south, exactly as the map suggested. Streetlights thinned as she turned off the main avenue. The air changed. Salt from the nearby docks mixing with diesel residue that never fully leaves industrial districts. Patrol units had arrived first. Blue lights reflected off sheet metal fencing surrounding a partially demolished loading platform. The victim lay near a temporary signal post, one of those portable caution lights contractors use during survey assessments. Male, early 50s. Conscious, but barely, blood pooled beneath his shoulder. Not a head strike this time. Penetration wound. Sharp instrument. Controlled. Name, Monroe asked, kneeling beside him. He struggled to focus. Green? He whispered. Not a name, a word, then unconsciousness. Paramedics stabilized and transported. Monroe stood slowly. Different location, same language. Red. Signal. Green. But this attack had escalated. Blunt force trauma had shifted to edged weapon. Intent intensifying. She scanned the ground. Boot impressions again. Narrow toe. Distinct triangular notch in the tread. Same footwear. Which meant either Kessler had accomplice access to identical gear, or Kessler had never been the only one wearing it. Crime scene flagged a fresh set of tire impressions beyond the fence line. Wider wheelbase than a sedan. Possibly a utility vehicle. A portable signal post lay knocked over beside the victim. Its battery pack was smashed deliberately. Monroe crouched near the temporary light. The casing had been opened with precision. Internal wiring rearranged. Not vandalized. Modified. She photographed everything. ID on victim, she asked. Officer Ramirez checked his tablet. Preliminary. Thomas Belden. State Procurement Auditor. Monroe's jaw tightened. Belden's name had appeared on Kessler's marked map, scheduled to inspect reactivation proposals as multiple dormant rail corridors, which meant the pattern held. Except Kessler was in custody. Monroe returned to headquarters at 3040 a.m. Kessler remained in interrogation. She entered without speaking. He looked up calmly. "Green?" he asked. She said nothing. His expression shifted slightly. Not surprise. Calculation. "That wasn't supposed to happen tonight," he said. Monroe's eyes sharpened. "Ooh." Silence. "You heard the radio," she pressed. "Another assault. Same language. Same footwear. That's impossible." "Is it?" He leaned back slowly. "You don't understand the sequence." "Explain it." He hesitated. Then, red is warning. Green is consequence. "You escalated." "No." His voice carried the first trace of agitation. "I hadn't authorized green." Monroe let that settle. "Authorized. You're not alone." He didn't answer. But he didn't deny it. She placed a printed still frame on the table, enhanced from traffic camera footage near Harbor Spur Extension. A utility vehicle. Older model. Distinct dent along rear quarter panel. "You recognize it?" He glanced once. "A fraction too long." "Yes?" Woos. No reply. Monroe shifted tone. "You think you're preventing disaster. You think you're correcting systemic negligence. But whoever attacked Belden tonight isn't following your timing." He stared at the table. "You moved too soon," she continued. "You forced acceleration." His jaw tightened again. "You arrested me out of order." "There is no order." "There is always order." She leaned forward. "Who said wait for green on the scanner?" His eyes flicked up. First real fracture in composure. "You accessed the recordings." "Yes." Silence expanded between them. Finally, he exhaled once. "Calder." Full name. "Kyle Calder." Relationship. Former apprentice. Signal calibration trainee, 2013 to 2014. Also terminated. Kessler nodded faintly. After the derailment, they downsized the department. Monroe requested Calder's file immediately. Age 29 at termination. No criminal record. Address listed at time of employment. 3 blocks from Freight Line Road corridor. Current status unknown. Employment history since termination showed short-term construction contracts, several tied to municipal infrastructure subcontractors, including one recently awarded preliminary surveying work for Harbor Spur Extension. Monroe pulled up driver's license photo. Angular features. Lean younger. Overlay comparison with traffic still. Match probability high. She returned to Kessler. "You taught him the system." "Wes." "He believes what you believe." "Wes." "But he's not waiting for red anymore." Kessler looked genuinely unsettled. "He doesn't understand threshold protocol." "Threshold protocol. Escalation requires confirmation." "You mean injury versus death?" He didn't respond. Monroe didn't need him to. She stood. "Calder accelerated beyond your design." Kessler spoke as she reached the door. "He thinks urgency equals righteousness. And you don't." He met her gaze. "I believe in timing." Back in the operations room, Monroe assembled updated victim overlay maps. Freight Line Road. Switching Tower. Harbor Spur Extension. Each location corresponded to nodes marked red on Kessler's seized maps. But there were additional nodes circled in yellow. Unexecuted. Future dates approaching within days. If Calder believed Kessler had been prematurely removed from the sequence, he might attempt to complete the progression faster. Monroe requested statewide BLO on the utility vehicle. Dent rear quarter panel. Dark paint. Possible stolen plates. She also requested contractor logs for Harbor Spur site access. Calder's name appeared on yesterday's sign-in sheet. Entry at 9:14 p.m., no recorded exit, which meant he may still be local, or he left off record. At 5:22 a.m., hospital update came through. Belden survived surgery. Condition critical but stable. He had regained brief consciousness during transport. Paramedic recorded one additional word. Tower. Monroe froze. Switching tower. Not Harbor Spur, which suggested something else entirely. Belden had been lured south, but his focus wasn't south. It was north. Freight Line Road. Monroe replayed the sequence. If Kessler's structure was red warning first, then green consequence. Calder's escalation might not abandon the original anchor point. It might amplify it. She checked tower perimeter units. Patrol presence had reduced after Kessler's arrest. Only one cruiser remained stationed half-mile east. If Calder perceived the tower as symbolic control, he would return, not to hide, to assert. Monroe ordered immediate redeployment to Freight Line Road. As units mobilized, dispatch interrupted. Unverified report of smoke near the switching tower. Timestamp 5:31 a.m. Monroe didn't speak. Didn't hesitate. If Calder rejected timing, he wouldn't wait for green. He'd create it. The convoy reached the rail yard in under 6 minutes. Thin gray smoke drifted from the fourth-floor window. Not heavy. Controlled. Inside, firefighters prepared entry. Monroe pushed through. Up the stairwell. 2 steps at a time. The fourth-floor door hung open. Inside, the portable scanner crackled again. Different frequency. Not police. Rail dispatch emergency channel. On the floor beside it lay a small battery, powered flare, red smoke device used for track signaling emergencies. Not fire. Signal. Painted in spray across the interior wall, fresh, bold letters A's G-R-E-M-E-N-S-G-O. Monroe scanned the room. No body. No suspect. But one new object lay on the windowsill. A folded reflective vest. Not Kessler's, smaller, younger cut, and beneath it, a printed city council meeting agenda. Date circled. Tomorrow. Location Municipal Infrastructure Review Board. Topic Freight Line Reactivation Proposal. Public session. Open attendance. Monroe understood immediately. Calder wasn't escalating randomly. He was shifting the stage. From abandoned corridors to visible platforms. From shadows to systems. If red meant warning and green meant consequence, then tomorrow's meeting might not be debate. It might be declaration. By 7:10 a.m., the switching tower was cleared. No accelerants. No structural fire damage. The smoke had come entirely from a rail-grade emergency flare. Deliberately placed, deliberately visible, deliberately temporary. A message, not destruction. Escalation through symbolism. Monroe stood in the fourth-floor control room as daylight blawed through fractured glass. The spray-painted words, GRMANS-GO, cut across the peeling concrete wall in sharp industrial lettering. Not rushed. Measured strokes. Calder wanted it read clearly. Crime scene recovered partial glove fibers from the flare casing. Synthetic blend. Common in construction safety gloves. Nothing distinctive, yet. The scanner, still active, was tuned to municipal transit coordination frequency. Not police. Calder wasn't listening for patrol response. He was listening for infrastructure chatter. For schedule confirmations. For movement. Monroe's phone vibrated. State records confirmed Kyle Calder had checked out of a rented storage unit 2 days ago. Location, Dockside Industrial Complex, less than a mile from Harbor Spur Extension. Warrant executed immediately. Inside the unit, officers found stacked signal hardware, old relay components, wiring spools, portable battery packs, reflective signage, temporary rail markers, and a corkboard. Photographs pinned in chronological order. 2014 derailment aftermath. Injured workers. News clippings. Budget reduction headlines. Then newer images. Council members entering meetings. Consultants at public hearings. Belden exiting the procurement office. Hargrove at a site visit. Melissa Grant speaking at a logistics conference. Every photo annotated. Dates, times, route notes. Below them, a printed header, PSTWO visibly co-RRT Moan. Monroe stared at it. Phase 2. Which meant Phase 1 had been the rail yard assaults. Warnings. Now escalation was shifting to visibility. She returned to headquarters and pulled the full agenda for tomorrow's Municipal Infrastructure Review Board session. Open to public. Security minimal. Estimated attendance, 60-80. Presenters included consultants, transportation board members, procurement oversight. Belden had been scheduled to testify remotely. If he survived long enough, Monroe assembled a briefing with tactical command. Calder's behavior pattern indicates symbolic messaging escalating toward public demonstration, she said. He's transitioning from industrial isolation to civic visibility. One lieutenant frowned. You think he's planning a mass casualty? No. She shook her head. Not indiscriminate. Targeted. Performative. Meaning. He believes he's correcting timing. He wants consequence witnessed. Silence filled the room. Monroe continued. His mentor Kessler structured red warning first protocol. Calder has abandoned the delay phase. But he still believes in signal language. She displayed a map overlay. Freight Line Road. Harbor Spur Extension, Municipal Infrastructure Building, all connected by historic rail spurs. You're saying he'll stage something that mirrors signal mechanics? Another officer asked. Yes? Explosive. Unlikely. Too chaotic. He's system-oriented. Then what? Monroe paused. A forced halt. She pulled up transit schematics for the downtown corridor. Although Freight Line was inactive, several active freight arteries intersected near municipal property. If someone manipulated signal relays, even temporarily, it could freeze rail traffic, economic disruption, public spectacle, visible correction. And if done during a council session discussing reactivation, the symbolism would be absolute. Monroe returned to interrogation. Kessler sat rigid. You didn't teach him restraint, she began. I taught him structure. He's escalating. He doesn't understand thresholds. You said escalation requires confirmation. Wes. Confirmation of what? Kessler hesitated. Imminent risk. To infrastructure. To life. You believed another derailment was coming. Yes. Eyes it. He met her gaze steadily. They reduced inspection cycles again last quarter. Monroe verified through public records. Maintenance interval adjustments had been approved recently. Cost-saving measure. No public safety alerts. No official red flags. But Kessler's past warnings had once been dismissed, and he had been right, at least about signal malfunction risk. You think Calder believes catastrophe is imminent? Monroe said. He thinks urgency equals morality. Would he sabotage a live system? Kessler went quiet. That's not an answer. He looked at the table. He wouldn't understand cascading impact. A meaning yes. Monroe left the room with urgency tightening in her chest. If Calder attempted unauthorized signal interference on an active line, even briefly, freight coordination errors could compound quickly. She contacted Transit Authority Emergency Operations. Full diagnostic sweep ordered across downtown signal network. So far, no anomalies. At 30:18 p.m., a call came in from a maintenance supervisor. Detective, you might want to see this. Monroe arrived at a rail control substation 2 blocks from the municipal building. Exterior access panel showed scratch marks, not forced, unlocked with proper rail key. Inside, wiring remained intact, but a secondary battery pack had been installed inline, temporary, inactive, yet primed. Monroe crouched beside it. Calder had prepared a manual override. One switch flip could disrupt signal communication across 3 intersecting freight lines for approximately 90 seconds before automatic failsafe engaged. 90 seconds was enough. Enough to halt trains. Enough to trigger emergency response. Enough to create visible chaos. And if timed during the council meeting, every news outlet would capture it. Signal failure during infrastructure debate. Proof, in his mind, that the system remained broken. Monroe checked time. Council meeting 9:00 a.m. tomorrow. Current time 4:02 p.m. She ordered 24-hour surveillance on all nearby substations. Uniformed presence increased at municipal building, but something unsettled her. Calder had demonstrated rehearsal behavior. The scanner recordings, the phased assaults, the smoke signal. He didn't execute first attempts without trial runs, which meant there was likely a dry run scheduled before tomorrow. She pulled Kessler's map again. One yellow circled node remained within city limits. Inactive spur behind an old grain terminal. Time written beside it. Today's date, 7:30 p.m. Monroe didn't announce it to the room. She simply grabbed her jacket. By 7:18 p.m., units were positioned near the grain terminal spur. The location was isolated but adjacent to an active freight bypass line. If Calder wanted to test override timing, this was ideal. Monroe waited inside an unmarked vehicle. Wind rattled corrugated siding of the abandoned grain silos. At 7:29 p.m., a utility vehicle turned onto the service road. Dent along rear quarter panel. Engine cut. Calder stepped out, reflective vest on, calm, carrying a small case. He moved directly toward the access panel. No hesitation. No scanning. Confidence of familiarity. Monroe let him reach the panel. Let him kneel. Let him unlock it. Only when his hand hovered above the secondary switch did she step out. Don't. Or her voice carried clean across the yard. Calder froze. Didn't turn. You don't understand, he said quietly. Step away from the panel. If they won't stop, I will. By risking lives. I'm preventing Roe moved closer. You don't get to simulate disaster to prove disaster. He finally turned. His expression wasn't rage. It was conviction sharpened by impatience. You arrested him out of order, he said. Kessler is in custody. He was red. You're trying to be green. He stared at her. Yes. Units emerged from concealment. Weapons drawn but steady. Calder's eyes flicked toward them, then back to Monroe. If they continue tomorrow, he said, it won't just be 90 seconds. The statement hung in the air. Not threat. Prediction. Monroe closed the distance further. You've already escalated beyond warning. Belden could have died. He signed clearance. He signed paperwork. That paperwork kills people. Not tonight, Monroe replied. Not on your timeline. His gaze hardened. You think this stops because you're here. It stops because systems adapt. He gave a faint, almost pitying look. They adapt after failure. Before anyone could react, he moved. Not toward the switch, but toward a second device in his case. Smaller. Handheld. Monroe lunged, units shouted. Calder pressed a button. For half a second, nothing happened. Then, somewhere beyond the yard, a freight horn blared sharply. Emergency stop protocol. Monroe's radio crackled instantly. Unscheduled signal interruption on bypass line. Trains halting. Stanby. Calder had not flipped the local override. He had triggered something remote. Monroe slammed him to the gravel as officers secured his hands. The handheld device clattered aside. Within seconds, rail dispatch reported automatic system recovery. No collision. No derailment. Failsafes held. 42 seconds of disruption. Test run successful. Calder lay on the ground, breathing hard. Not fighting. Just staring upward. You see, he said calmly. They still fail. Monroe looked toward the horizon where halted freight cars sat motionless under twilight. No injuries. No catastrophe. But visible. Audible. Documented. Tomorrow's meeting would not be theoretical anymore. It would begin under proof of vulnerability. Monroe pulled Calder to his feet. You're done, she said. He didn't resist. As they escorted him to the vehicle, he spoke one final sentence. You can arrest Green. He looked back toward the silent rails. But you can't arrest what's broken. Kyle Calder did not ask for a lawyer. He did not request a phone call. He asked for a maintenance log. Specifically, last quarter's inspection intervals for signal nodes across the freight line and downtown bypass corridors. Monroe did not indulge him. Instead, she ordered an immediate forensic sweep of the handheld device he had triggered at the grain terminal spur. Initial analysis revealed something precise and deeply unsettling. The device was not a crude jammer. It was a modified relay interrupter, built using legitimate rail components, configured to simulate a signal conflict rather than create one. In rail systems, when two signal inputs contradict, the system defaults to fail, safe halt. Calder had not attempted to cause collision. He had forced a protective stop. 42 seconds of controlled disruption. A rehearsal, not sabotage. Monroe stood in the operations center as transit engineers explained the mechanics. He piggybacked onto a secondary maintenance frequency. One engineer said, if he had sustained the signal conflict longer than 90 seconds, we would have locked down 3 additional junctions automatically. Would that have endangered a train? Monroe asked. Not directly. It would have delayed them. Possibly caused cascading congestion. Economic impact. Public spectacle. Systemic embarrassment. Calder was targeting perception of fragility, not immediate fatalities. But perception can shift policy faster than statistics. Back in interrogation, Monroe sat across from him. "You forced a halt," she said. "Less. Without derailment. Less. You proved the system responds. Less. Then why escalate further?" Calder leaned forward slightly. "Because they won't respond unless it costs them." "You think delay costs enough?" "No." His tone sharpened. "Delay embarrasses. Injury frightens. Death reforms." The statement landed cold. "You're accelerating toward that conclusion," Monroe said. "I'm accelerating toward acknowledgement. You stabbed Belden. He signed clearance. That's not a justification. It's causation." Monroe studied him carefully. He did not display thrill-seeking behavior. No impulsivity. No chaotic rage. Everything he did aligned with symbolic logic. Red pot warning, green consequence. Phase 1 to targeted injury. Phase 2 visible disruption. But what was Phase 3? She retrieved the corkboard photo from the storage unit. "PHS to WO Vesabiasikara. Where's Phase 3? She asked. Calder remained silent. She shifted strategy. "You and Kessler disagree on timing." He hesitates. He believes in confirmation. He believes catastrophe must prove itself first. "And you don't." "I believe waiting is complicity." Monroe let that settle. "You weren't present at the derailment in 2014, she said. "No." "You didn't see the injured workers." "I saw the reports." "You saw aftermath through him." Calder's jaw tightened. He tried to stop it. Hay filed warnings. They ignored him. "Less. And that made you certain the system only reacts after harm." "Wes." "So you decided to simulate harm." Silence. Not denial. Monroe stood. "You're not a whistleblower," she said. "You're not a reformer. You're manufacturing instability to justify your fear." He didn't respond. But something flickered behind his composure. Doubt, or recalibration. At 6:40 a.m., the morning of the Municipal Infrastructure Review Board meeting, the city buzzed with unusual media presence. News outlets had picked up reports of the previous night's 42-second rail halt. Transit Authority labeled it minor signal anomaly. Unofficial leaks called it intentional interference. Council members arrived early. Security increased modestly. Monroe stationed officers inside and outside the municipal building. Both Kessler and Calder were in custody. Both devices recovered. All known marked nodes under guard. Yet she couldn't ignore one inconsistency. Calder's remote trigger at the grain terminal required physical proximity within a half-mile radius. But the earlier Harbor Spur attack occurred while Kessler was in custody and Calder's vehicle had been logged entering the contractor yard. Timeline overlap was narrow. Possible. But tight. She reviewed scanner audio again. The unidentified voice. Wet for green. Voice analysis had not matched Kessler or Calder, which meant there was still a third variable. At AC 52 a.m., Monroe stood along the back wall of the council chamber. Public attendance moderate. Press cameras rolling. Agenda Item 4 Freight Line Reactivation Proposal. As the session opened, she scanned the room carefully. Consultants. Board members. Transit engineers. Procurement staff. Belden's chair remained empty. His condition still critical. The chair beside it held a substitute auditor. Monroe's gaze paused briefly on a man seated near the rear aisle. Mid-50s. Gray jacket. Unremarkable. Watching the room too intently. Not taking notes. Not speaking. Just observing. She flagged plainclothes to maintain visual. At 9:17 a.m., during presentation of projected maintenance costs, Monroe's radio vibrated discreetly. Transit Diagnostics reported minor signal fluctuation downtown, within acceptable margin. But irregular. She stepped into the hallway. Location. She asked dispatch quietly. Substation 3 blocks east. No override detected. 3 blocks east. Exactly where the previous inline battery pack had been discovered. She moved immediately. 2 officers followed. Inside the substation access panel, the previously removed secondary battery slot had been replaced. Not by Calder. He was in custody. This was new hardware. Activated. Monroe's pulse steadied. Keel main feed. She ordered. Transit control complied. Within seconds, signal fluctuation stabilized. Battery pack removed. Device tagged. This one was more sophisticated. Timed relay, not manual, set to trigger during peak meeting time, but interrupted. Monroe's jaw tightened. Calder's rehearsal had been visible. This was covered. Different design, different logic. She returned to the council building. The gray, jacketed man remained seated, calm, watching. Monroe approached quietly. "Sir, may I speak with you outside?" He looked up mildly. "Of course." In the hallway, she kept her tone neutral. Name: Len Mercer. Occupation: Independent Transit Systems Consultant. She requested ID. Valid. Cross-referenced quickly. Mercer had served as external reviewer on signal modernization proposals statewide, including Freight Line Corridor. She watched his eyes carefully. "You're aware of the disruptions last night?" she said. "Yes." Law. System vulnerability requires transparency. Neutral statement, measured. "Were you aware of any unauthorized access attempts this morning?" she asked. "No." His expression remained steady. Too steady. "You've worked with Kessler?" she asked suddenly, a fractional pause. "Yes." "Years ago." "Relationship?" "He was talented, disgruntled, underutilized." "And Calder?" "Apprentice, idealistic." Monroe held his gaze. "You believe the system requires forced demonstration?" All his lips curved faintly. "I believe reform follows evidence. Evidence created." He didn't answer directly. Instead, "If you're asking whether I sympathize with their concerns, yes. Concerns don't justify manipulation. Sometimes they justify exposure." Monroe's radio buzzed again. Transit diagnostics confirmed additional attempted signal interference. This time 15 miles outside city limits. Inactive spur. Yellow, circled node. Exactly as marked on Kessler's map. Mercer had been in this building during both city disruptions, meaning he hadn't physically triggered them, unless Monroe's mind aligned the pattern. The grain terminal rehearsal, the substation battery, the out-of-city node, multiple actors, distributed access. She looked back at Mercer. "Who else?" she asked quietly. He regarded her calmly. "You assume structure implies conspiracy. You assume fragility implies righteousness." He offered a faint smile. "You arrested red. You detained green. But signals propagate." Monroe stepped closer. "How many?" He did not answer. Instead, he said something else. "You're focusing on individuals. The system is the problem." "That's ideology," she replied. "Not accountability." He met her gaze. "Then you'd better fix it before someone else decides to." Monroe signaled officers. Mercer was detained pending further investigation. Not yet charged, but now undeniably connected. Back inside the chamber, debate continued uninterrupted. No one in the public seats knew how close the city had come to a cascading disruption. Monroe stood at the rear wall again, watching, listening, thinking. Kessler believed in warning before consequence. Calder believed urgency justified acceleration. Mercer believed exposure forced reform. 3 tiers, red, green, and something else. A signal beyond binary. Because if nodes were being triggered beyond Mercer's immediate presence, then the structure was larger still. She checked updated diagnostics. The out-of-city disruption had ceased. No derailment, no casualties, but intentional and timed. Monroe felt it settle in her chest. This was no longer about revenge for 2014. It was no longer about warning infrastructure committees. It was about creating a distributed proof of failure network, a movement disguised as maintenance. And if they were escalating phases, then Phase 3 had not yet occurred. As the council chair called for public comment, Monroe's phone vibrated with a forensic update. Voice analysis on the original scanner recording. Wait for green. Match found. Not Mercer. Not Calder. Not Kessler. The voice belonged to someone still active within the transit authority. Current employee. Signal system supervisor. Name appearing on maintenance oversight approvals. A man who still had legitimate master access to the network. Monroe read the name twice, because if that was accurate, then red and green were never rogue. They were being guided, and the next signal would not require trespass at all. The name on the forensic report was Daniel Rourke, current position Senior Signal Systems Supervisor, North Valley Transit Authority. Employed continuously since 2009. Direct oversight on maintenance interval adjustments approved last quarter. Monroe read the profile twice. Rourke had not been flagged in Kessler's termination records. He had not appeared in Calder's storage unit photos. He had not attended the council meeting that morning, which meant he preferred distance. Distance from scenes. Distance from spectacle, but proximity to access. She left 2 detectives at the council building and moved immediately toward Transit Authority headquarters. On the drive, she reviewed Rourke's internal communications. Maintenance review memos, inspection deferment justifications, budget rationalizations. Nothing overtly suspicious, everything bureaucratically clean. But when she cross-referenced timestamps of recent signal irregularities, Rourke had been logged into supervisory terminals during 2 of them. Coincidence possible, yet unlikely. At 11:12 a.m., Monroe entered the signal control floor. Rows of monitors displayed live rail traffic diagrams, color-coded lines, green for clear, red for stop, yellow for caution. Rourke stood near the center console, mid-40s, composed, professional posture. He turned as she approached. "Detective Monroe," he said evenly. "I was told you might come." "You were told?" she asked. "Council security informed transit leadership you were investigating signal tampering." Measured tone. No visible tension. "Step away from the console," she said. He complied immediately. No hesitation. "Am I under arrest?" he asked calmly. "Not yet." She signaled for forensic techs to isolate his terminal. "Do you know Evan Kessler?" "Wes." "Do you know Kyle Calder?" "Wes." "In what capacity?" "Former colleagues." "Still in contact?" "No." His eye contact did not waver. Too steady. Monroe placed a printed transcript excerpt in front of him. Audio waveform timestamped 3 days prior. Voice line "Wait for green." Rourke glanced down, a fractional tightening at the corner of his mouth. "That could be anyone," he said. "It's you," Monroe replied. Forensic voice match confidence 92.4%. He didn't argue the number. Instead, he folded his hands loosely. "You're aware of the derailment in 2014? Monroe continued. "Wes. You supervised signal recalibration in the months following." "Wes. You approved reduced inspection cycles last quarter." "Budget constraints." "You knew Kessler believed catastrophe was imminent." "I knew he was obsessive." "And you?" He tilted his head slightly. "I believe systems degrade when ignored." "You believe in forcing acknowledgement?" "I believe in transparency. Through illegal interference. Through demonstration." Monroe studied him. Unlike Calder, Rourke carried no impatience. Unlike Kessler, no bitterness. His posture conveyed strategic patience. "You let them take visible risks," she said quietly. "Red and green," he replied. "You guided them. I advised caution. Wait for green." That meant wait for proof. Proof of what? Structural neglect. Monroe leaned in. "You orchestrated distributed disruptions." "No. You leveraged their ideology." "I understood it." "You remained inside the system." "Someone had to." Silence stretched. Monroe shifted angle. "The substation battery installed this morning was more advanced than Calder's design." Rourke said nothing. "It required supervisory access codes." The still silence. "Forensic log shows your credentials authenticated that substation at 8:03 a.m. He met her gaze. "That's routine inspection." "Inspection coinciding with attempted time disruption." "Coincidence." "You expect that to hold?" He inhaled slowly. "Detective, do you know how many signal faults go unreported because they auto-correct?" "That's not the point." "It is exactly the point." His tone sharpened for the first time. "You see interruption. I see warning. You see yourself as red." He considered that. "No." "Green?" "No." "Then what?" He looked at the console screens. "Yellow. Caution. Not stop. Not go. Proceed carefully." Monroe felt the pattern realign. Kessler to red's a warning. Calder's green's consequence. Rourke yellow's control phase. Guiding thresholds. Escalation management. Distributed action. Centralized calibration. "You moderated them," she said. "I prevented catastrophe." "You facilitated illegality." "I prevented derailment." She held his gaze. "You believe if disruption is controlled, it justifies itself. I believe exposure without injury is ethical." Belden was stabbed. That was Calder exceeding scope. So you lost control. Rourke's jaw tightened subtly. Calder is impulsive. And you're not. I calculate. Monroe signaled for his terminal logs to be mirrored. Forensics quickly identified encrypted communication threads routed through maintenance ticket systems. Seemingly routine service notes embedded with coded phrases. Color references. Timestamps. Threshold markers. This wasn't random coordination. It was structured. She turned back to him. How many nodes were you prepared to trigger tomorrow if council approved reactivation? He didn't answer. Instead, he asked something unexpected. Did the derailment file include injury photos? Yes. Did it include the internal memo dismissing Kessler's warnings? Yes. And you still think ignoring structural vulnerability prevents harm? Monroe didn't take the bait. You don't get to destabilize a transit network to win policy arguments. I didn't destabilize it, he replied calmly. I proved its fragility. By manufacturing faults. But revealing tolerance thresholds. Monroe felt the weight of it. He wasn't entirely wrong about vulnerability, but intent matters. Authority matters. Consent matters. You created a feedback loop, she said. Red alerts generate fear. Green generates consequence. Yellow maintains visibility. He said nothing. You built a distributed signaling movement. He held her gaze. You can arrest individuals, he said quietly. You cannot arrest systemic decay. She stepped back. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit infrastructure interference and reckless endangerment. He did not resist. As officers cuffed him, he looked at the signal board one last time. All lines green. Stable. Operational. He spoke softly. Watch them in 6 months. Back at headquarters, Monroe assembled the full matrix. Kessler, ideological origin. Calder, accelerated executor. Rourke, embedded supervisor. 3 tiers of escalation. But the encrypted maintenance tickets revealed something further. Additional coded exchanges rotted throughout of state transit authorities. Different corridors. Different cities. Same color references. Red. Green. Yellow. Monroe felt the magnitude expand. This wasn't isolated grievance. It was a template. A playbook. Target underfunded infrastructure. Identify ideological insiders. Stage controlled disruptions. Force policy acknowledgement. Replicate elsewhere. She called federal liaison immediately, because jurisdiction had just outgrown municipal authority. At 7:48 p.m., as formal charges processed, Monroe reviewed the final forensic sweep of Rourke's workstation. One draft file remained unsent. Subject line PSS HRERVR CBLEPRO off. Attachment unopened. Encrypted. Timestamp scheduled for auto. Release at 900 p.m., exactly 12 minutes from now. Monroe stared at the clock. If Phase 1 was injury, Phase 2 visible disruption, Phase 3 might not be controlled at all. She ordered immediate isolation of transit network from remote supervisory overrides. Engineers moved quickly. At 8:59 p.m., encryption specialists cracked partial metadata of the draft attachment. It wasn't a signal override. It wasn't a maintenance script. It was a system vulnerability report. Compiled evidence of deferred inspections across multiple corridors. Internal memos highlighting risk exposure. Projected failure modeling. If released publicly, it would expose not just negligence, but liability. Monroe exhaled slowly. Phase 3 wasn't derailment. It was disclosure. At 900 p.m., the draft attempted transmission. Firewall blocked it. Attachment secured. Rourke, seated in holding, closed his eyes when informed. Not in defeat. In acceptance. You were never going to crash a train, Monroe said through the cell bars. No, he replied quietly. You were going to crash confidence. Yes. And let the public do the rest. He met her gaze steadily. They deserve to know. Monroe held his stare. They deserve safety without sabotage. Outside, the rail network hummed normally. Freight lines moving. Signals green. Systems intact for now. But Monroe understood something else entirely. The arrests stopped the actors. They stopped the sequence. But the vulnerability report was real. And if ignored, the next red might not be symbolic. It might be mechanical. By morning, the arrests were public. Not all the details. Not the color-coded framework. Not the phased structure. But enough. 3 individuals connected to intentional rail signal disruptions. 2 former technicians, 1 active supervisor. Media simplified it quickly. Transit sabotage ring. Monroe disliked the term. Sabotage implied chaos. This had been structured, calibrated, contained, until it wasn't. At 8:30 a.m., the mayor's office requested immediate briefing. At 9:00 a.m., the Transit Authority Board convened emergency session. At 9:45 a.m., legal counsel from the state requested custody review of the seized vulnerability report. Because now the real question was no longer criminal. It was political. Monroe stood before the assembled officials in a closed conference room overlooking the downtown rail corridor. Freight lines moved steadily below, unaware of the tension above. She summarized cleanly. Kessler initiated ideologically motivated warning assaults tied to perceived infrastructure neglect. Calder escalated to visible signal disruptions. Rourke embedded himself within supervisory control and structured controlled demonstrations to expose systemic vulnerability. A council member interrupted. Was the network ever in real danger of collision? No, Monroe replied. Failsafes engaged during all disruptions. Then no harm occurred. She held his gaze. Harm is not limited to collision. Silence followed. The transit board chair leaned forward. The vulnerability report they attempted to release. Is it credible? Yes. Another silence. Is it exaggerated? No. A murmur passed around the table. Monroe continued. It documents deferred maintenance cycles, component aging beyond recommended thresholds, and budget-driven inspection reductions. Some of the risks are statistically low probability, but high impact. The mayor's chief of staff spoke next. If we release that report, public trust collapses. If you bury it, Monroe replied evenly, and a mechanical failure occurs later, public trust doesn't collapse. It detonates. The room went still. This was no longer about red and green. It was about accountability. After the meeting, Monroe returned to headquarters. Kessler had requested to speak again. She entered the holding room. You read it, he said immediately. The report. Yes. He nodded once. They won't fix it unless they fear exposure. They fear liability. She corrected. Liability creates reform. You justified assault for that. I justified warning. You can't control how warnings evolve. He didn't respond. She shifted. Did you know Rourke planned full disclosure? No. Would you have supported it? Yes. Even if it collapsed transit funding temporarily. If collapse prevents death. Monroe studied him carefully. His logic remained rigid, but not malicious. He believed in systemic correction through pressure. Calder, in contrast, believed pressure required escalation. Rourke believed exposure required choreography. 3 philosophies, 1 infrastructure. At noon, Federal Liaison confirmed multi-state review of encrypted maintenance communications. Other cities, other supervisors. No confirmed disruptions yet, but similar language threads detected. Red, Greenlow. The model had traveled. Monroe felt the implications expand beyond jurisdiction. If Phase 3 disclosure had been blocked, others might attempt release elsewhere, and without Rourke's controlled exposure, restraint, someone less disciplined could miscalculate. At 20:14 p.m., the hospital called. Thomas Belden regained full consciousness. Monroe arrived within 20 minutes. He was pale but stable. She stood beside his bed. Do you remember the attack? Yes. Did you know Calder? No. Did you receive warnings about infrastructure risk prior to this week? He hesitated. Privately? From who? Anonymous emails. Color references. His eyes narrowed. Yes. Red. Yes. Green. Yes. Monroe felt confirmation settle. The signaling campaign had extended beyond physical nodes. It had entered digital messaging. Psychological pressure layered atop physical disruption. Why didn't you report it? She asked. I thought it was activist rhetoric. Did you investigate the claims? He looked away. We're always balancing risk with funding. That wasn't the question. He didn't answer. Monroe left the hospital with a new weight. The vulnerability report wasn't fabricated. It was compiled from real data. Deferred inspections were real. Aging relays were real. Budget cuts were real. The difference was method. Transparency through process, or transparency through engineered crisis. At 6:03 p.m., news broke that an anonymous online account had posted partial excerpts of infrastructure maintenance memos. Not the full vulnerability report, but enough to spark speculation. The post ended with 3 words CCKTHECGmails. Monroe stared at the screen. Rourke's file had been secured, transmission blocked, which meant someone else possessed data fragments. Distributed network. She returned to interrogation, this time with Mercer. He sat composed. "You didn't need Rourke's release," she said. "You seeded copies." He offered no expression. "You distributed redundancy." "Redundancy is responsible design," he replied mildly. "How many cities?" "Concern is national." "That's not an answer." He leaned slightly forward. "You can arrest me. But if maintenance remains deferred, others will emerge." "You're not reformers," she said. "You're accelerants." He tilted his head. "And you're preservers." The statement lingered. Not accusation. Observation. Monroe exited without responding. By nightfall, public debate intensified. Some commentators framed the arrested men as extremists. Others called them whistleblowers. Transit Authority released a measured statement acknowledging ongoing review of maintenance protocols. No admission of negligence. No denial of vulnerability. Balanced language, careful. At 10:04 p.m., Monroe stood alone on the 4th floor of the abandoned switching tower. Crime scene tape fluttered in the wind. The spray-painted message had been removed. Concrete scrubbed. The scanner gone. The room quiet again. She looked out across the dead rails. Red signals frozen permanently. She replayed everything. They had not tried to derail trains. They had tried to derail complacency. But their method risked creating exactly the catastrophe they claimed to prevent. A system under stress can misinterpret artificial faults. And someday, failsafes might not hold. Her phone buzzed. Transit Authority internal memo draft. Subject emergency budget reallocation proposal. Immediate inspection cycle restoration recommended. No press release yet. But movement. Actual movement. Monroe stared at the document. Kessler believed red had been ignored. Calder believed green was necessary. Rourke believed yellow managed perception. But in the end, it wasn't red-green or yellow that moved policy. It was exposure under arrest, legal consequence, institutional pressure. She looked again at the dead signals outside. In abandoned systems, red means nothing, unless someone remembers why it was built. Her radio crackled softly. Federal liaison confirmed additional encrypted nodes had gone silent. Movement paused. For now. Monroe descended the tower stairs slowly. The case was not closed. Charges would move forward. Trials would unfold. Public opinion would fracture. But tonight, the rails were stable. The network intact. And the signals, for the first time in days, were not being forced to change. The arraignments drew more press than the mayor's emergency address. By 8:00 a.m., the courthouse were divided. One side held transit workers demanding accountability for reckless endangerment. The other held activists holding signs that read FIXTECGMALs, less done to RED. Monroe stood inside the courtroom perimeter, observing rather than participating. Kessler entered first. Calm proposed. Calder followed, jaw set, eyes scanning. Rourke entered last. Measured stride. No visible strain. The prosecution framed the trio as coordinated infrastructure saboteurs who risked catastrophic disruption. Defense counsel reframed them immediately. Whistleblowers who attempted controlled demonstrations after repeated institutional negligence. Language. Framing. Red versus reform. The judge ordered remand pending formal indictment review. Outside, public debate intensified. News outlets obtained partial maintenance statistics through freedom of information requests. Deferred inspections confirmed. Aging relay units documented. No imminent catastrophic warnings. But systemic strain undeniable. By afternoon, a national transit safety panel announced independent audit review of multiple corridors. Movement had begun. Monroe sat in the back of the courtroom during the preliminary evidentiary hearing. Prosecution presented the handheld interrupter device. 42 seconds of forced halt. Defense countered with transit engineer testimony. No collision risk. Automatic safeguards engaged within design parameters. Controlled disruption. The phrase echoed repeatedly. Then defense counsel played an excerpt from internal transit memos. One line highlighted. Inspection cycle extensions approved despite recommended thresholds. The courtroom shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Defense pivoted. Is it criminal to expose systemic vulnerability when internal warnings fail? Monroe felt the question hang. Kessler's warnings in 2014 had been dismissed. Calder's escalation had been reckless. Rourke's embedded choreography had been calculated. But the maintenance data was not fabricated. The vulnerability report existed. The system was strained. Prosecution countered sharply. Exposure does not grant license to manipulate live infrastructure. That distinction was clear legally. But morally, public discourse blurred it. During recess, Monroe was approached by Assistant District Attorney Hale. Public sentiment is softening, he said quietly. Toward them. Toward reform. Which defense is attaching to their narrative? They stabbed a man. Monroe replied evenly. Yes, that holds. Calder exceeded structure. Well, press attempted homicide. And Rourke. Conspiracy and unauthorized access. Hale paused. But the disclosure angle complicates jury perception. Monroe knew that already. By evening, the federal liaison confirmed something new. 2 additional transit authorities had voluntarily initiated inspection acceleration following media coverage. No disruptions, no arrests, just preemptive correction. Monroe absorbed the information slowly. The trio's structure had been dismantled, but their thesis, that exposure forces action, was gaining traction. That night, Monroe reviewed the decrypted fragments from Rourke's draft, Phase 3, attachment. Beyond maintenance logs, it included predictive modeling, failure probability curves, projected economic impact scenarios, comparative safety benchmarks. It was not ideological rhetoric. It was technical, structured, serious. She leaned back in her chair. If Rourke had released it without accompanying disruptions, would it have been ignored? She didn't know. Her phone vibrated. Hospital update. Thomas Belden requested to speak again. She returned to his room. He looked steadier now. Less pale. I've reviewed the internal audit documents, he said quietly. From the vulnerability report. Yes. And. He exhaled slowly. They're not wrong. Monroe said nothing. But, he continued, process exists for reform. Process takes time. Less. And if catastrophe occurs during that time, he met her gaze. That's the dilemma. Silence settled. Belden spoke again. I received anonymous emails months before the attacks. I dismissed them. Budget cycles are political realities. You didn't escalate them. No. Why? He hesitated. Because systemic risk is statistical. It rarely materializes. And when it does, it's too late. Monroe felt the weight of that truth. Statistical risk is invisible until it isn't. She left the hospital with something unsettled inside her. Back at headquarters, forensic analysts delivered final confirmation. Encrypted maintenance tickets had indeed been distributed beyond city limits, but no active interference scripts were found outside the trio's direct involvement. The wider network was ideological, not operational, at least for now. Rourke requested one final meeting before formal transfer to federal holding. Monroe agreed. He sat across from her, composed. You're being portrayed as architect, she said. I was moderator. You orchestrated distributed risk. I prevented escalation. Calder escalated anyway. Less. Because you normalized interference. He paused. Because urgency breeds impatience. You built a structure others could adopt. He held her gaze. Structures exist whether acknowledged or not. You regret it. He didn't answer immediately. I regret that internal warnings failed before this. That's not the question. No, he said quietly. I don't regret exposure. You regret the stabbing? Yes. Then why not pursue disclosure through lawful channels? He gave a faint, almost wary look. Have you ever filed an internal reform proposal? Yes. Did it move immediately? No pew. He nodded once. Exactly. Monroe leaned forward. You assumed engineered disruption was more efficient than bureaucracy. Less. And safer than waiting. Less. And now. He glanced toward the holding door. Now I assume reform will move faster. He wasn't wrong. But neither was he right. As she left, She realized something else. The trio hadn't intended to cause catastrophe, but they had operated on the belief that controlled instability was justifiable, and that belief, under different leadership, could evolve into something far less restrained. At 11:38 p.m., Monroe stood once more at the freight line rail yard perimeter. The switching tower loomed in silhouette. No smoke, no scanner, no flare, just cold metal and dormant track. The media narrative would settle eventually. Charges would proceed. Maintenance budgets would shift. Inspection cycles would tighten, but systems have memory, and movements leave residue. She looked at the permanent red signals along the dead tracks. In abandoned systems, red is symbolic. In active systems, red prevents disaster. The trio blurred that line deliberately. Tomorrow, indictments would formalize. Legal arguments would sharpen. Public opinion would divide. But tonight, the rails were quiet, stable. For now, Monroe turned back toward her vehicle, because she understood something most of the city did not yet grasp. Red and green were only phases. Yellow had been removed. But the conditions that created all three still existed. The indictments were handed down on a Thursday. Conspiracy to interfere with critical infrastructure. Unauthorized access to protected transit systems. Reckless endangerment. Attempted homicide, specific to Calder. Federal oversight was formally attached. The language was precise. Deliberate. No mention of ideology. No acknowledgement of reform. Only statute and violation. But outside the courthouse, the narrative refused to stay contained inside legal phrasing. Editorials multiplied. Extremists who risked lives. Engineers who forced accountability. Signal saboteurs or whistleblowers. Monroe ignored the headlines and focused on the timeline. Because something still bothered her. The original derailment in 2014 had injured 3 workers. No fatalities. Internal review had blamed delayed maintenance. Kessler's warnings had been documented, but buried beneath procedural language. Inspection cycles were extended again last quarter. Rourke embedded oversight adjustments into maintenance schedules. Calder accelerated demonstration. 3 men, separated by age and temperament, converged on one belief: the system corrects only after visible failure. But as Monroe reviewed federal intake documents, one statistic caught her attention. In the 6 days since the arrests, transit authorities in 4 separate states had quietly reinstated shortened inspection cycles. Emergency maintenance audits underway. No press release fanfare. No public confession. Just movement. The trio's actions had been halted. Yet reform was already unfolding. That unsettled her. Not because reform was wrong, but because it suggested a dangerous reinforcement loop: disrupt, expose, force reaction, repeat elsewhere. If that formula proved effective, it would not remain confined to rail systems. She requested a final joint debrief before federal transfer. Kessler, Calder, and Rourke were seated separately but visible through adjacent holding windows. She spoke to each in turn. Kessler first. "They've reinstated inspection cycles," she said. He absorbed that quietly. "Good. You didn't need assault for that. I tried paperwork first. You escalated to injury. I escalated to attention." She didn't argue. She moved to Calder. "Inspection cycles restored," she told him. His expression flickered. "So green worked?" "No," she said evenly. "Arrest worked." He looked unconvinced. "Finally, Rourke, multiple states reviewing maintenance protocols," she said. He nodded once. "Transparency accelerates reform. You nearly destabilized live corridors." I contained it." You didn't respond. Monroe left them there. Separated now. No longer red, green, and yellow. Just defendants. That evening, she met with the federal infrastructure liaison. A quiet man who spoke carefully. "You understand this won't end with these 3, he said. "How so?" "The vulnerability data they compiled is legitimate. Other transit authorities are reviewing similar exposures. Proactively," Monroe replied. "For now." He paused. "But if systemic risk remains statistically tolerable yet politically inconvenient, someone else may decide controlled disruption is efficient." Monroe felt the truth in that. Efficiency. That word had run silently beneath everything. Budget efficiency. Inspection efficiency. Escalation efficiency. Calder believed urgency justified acceleration. Rourke believed choreography justified exposure. Kessler believed warning justified consequence, all in the name of preventing catastrophe. But prevention built on engineered instability creates its own form of fragility. Late that night, Monroe returned to the rail control floor, not to investigate, to observe. The digital board displayed active freight movement, green lines flowing across the grid. Occasional red markers blinking briefly as trains slowed or passed. Yellow indicators flickering during scheduled maintenance. The system worked because red, yellow, and green meant specific things. Defined, authorized, bounded. When individuals redefine those signals privately, order erodes. Her phone vibrated with a final forensic addendum. The encrypted maintenance threads had one last fragment previously overlooked, a draft note never sent, authored by Rourke. Subject line, F. They ignore it again. The body of the draft read, Phase 3 cannot repeat indefinitely. Eventually, demonstration must give way to inevitability. Monroe read it twice. Inevitability. That word unsettled her more than green, because inevitability implied surrender to failure, not prevention. She requested full archive pull of internal transit reform proposals over the last decade. Many had been delayed. Some shelved. Few expedited without external pressure. The system had been strained before red and green ever appeared. That was the root. The trio had not created vulnerability. They exploited its neglect. As she left headquarters, dawn edged faintly over the horizon. The switching tower stood silent in the distance. The spray paint gone. The scanner gone. The flare residue cleaned. But memory lingers in infrastructure, and movements rarely vanish without echo. Monroe understood something clearly now. Arrests end actions. Trials end cases. But they do not end conditions. If inspection cycles remain protected only under spotlight, then spotlight becomes leverage. And leverage invites misuse. She stepped into the early morning air and listened. No freight horns blaring emergency stops. No forced halts. No artificial faults. Just the steady rhythm of trains moving because systems were functioning as designed. Red meant stop. Green meant go. Yellow meant caution. Simple. Until someone decides the definitions are insufficient. As federal transport vans departed with Kessler, Calder, and Rourke in custody, Monroe watched without satisfaction. The trio believed they were preventing disaster. In one narrow sense, they had accelerated reform. In another, they had introduced a method others might adopt without restraint. Her radio crackled softly. Transit control reporting routine maintenance completion ahead of schedule. Inspection cycles shortened. Audits underway. Movement real. She allowed herself one measured breath. Prevention, she realized, does not begin with disruption. It begins long before. With attention. With unglamorous inspection. With budgets defended before failure. Because once red must be forced, green is never far behind. And if green arrives without restraint, inevitability stops being theoretical. It becomes mechanical. The trial did not begin with rail diagrams. It began with language. Controlled disruption. Engineered exposure. Preventative escalation. Their defense counsel leaned heavily into those phrases during opening statements. These men did not seek chaos. The lead attorney said. They sought correction. They forced acknowledgement of documented vulnerability. The prosecution did not argue the existence of vulnerability. They argued authority. You do not fix a system. The prosecutor replied, by illegally manipulating it. You do not manufacture risk to prove risk. Monroe sat behind the prosecution table during the first week of testimony. Transit engineers confirmed the 42-second halt posed no collision risk. Forensic analysts demonstrated how the relay interrupter simulated conflict rather than cause it. Defense used that to emphasize restraint. Failsafes worked. They repeated. But then the hospital footage was introduced. Thomas Belden, pale and recovering, describing the stabbing. Not theoretical. Not symbolic. Not technical. Real. Calder's attorney tried to separate the assault from the signaling model. An impulsive deviation, he called it. But the prosecution reframed it sharply. When you normalize engineered instability, escalation is inevitable. The word hung in the courtroom. Inevitable. Monroe recognized it immediately from Rourke's unsent draft. The turning point came on the 9th day. A transit maintenance supervisor, unrelated to the trio, testified voluntarily. He described deferred inspection pressure, budget constraints, internal proposals delayed repeatedly. Then he said something unexpected. After the arrests, our inspection cycle was restored immediately. Defense leaned into it. So reform occurred. Yes. Because the issue was exposed. Yes. Murmurs rippled across the gallery. The prosecution rose for redirect. Did reform require signal manipulation? The supervisor hesitated. No. Did it require stabbing a public official? No. Would internal review have moved eventually? Yes. How quickly? The supervisor paused longer this time. Not as quickly. There it was. Speed versus safety. Efficiency versus process. The courtroom felt suspended between two truths. Reform accelerated after disruption. Disruption introduced unacceptable risk. During closing arguments, the prosecution abandoned moral grandstanding. They focused narrowly. The defendants assumed unilateral authority over critical infrastructure. However legitimate their concerns, their method endangered public trust and safety. Defense countered with a final appeal. When institutions ignore red flags, citizens respond. The judge's instructions were precise. The jury was not asked to evaluate infrastructure policy, only criminal conduct. After 3 days of deliberation, the verdict arrived. Kessler guilty on conspiracy and unauthorized interference. Not guilty on attempted homicide. Calder guilty on attempted homicide. Guilty on interference. Rourke guilty on conspiracy and unauthorized access. No sweeping ideological statement. No vindication. No martyrdom. Just accountability. Sentencing recommendations would follow. Outside the courthouse, commentary fractured predictably. Some called it justice. Others called it suppression. But inside the rail control center that same afternoon, something quieter occurred. Transit Authority approved permanent restoration of shortened inspection cycles. Independent oversight added. Public quarterly maintenance transparency reports scheduled. No fanfare. No banners. Just documentation. Monroe stood alone on the control floor again as the signal board glowed before her. Green line steady. Occasional yellow caution flickers. Brief red stops as freight trains yielded. The system breathed. Not perfectly. Not invulnerably. But attentively. Her phone buzzed once more. Federal memo confirming no further distributed interference threads active. The network that had formed around red, green, and yellow had fractured. At least for now. Later that evening, Monroe drove back to Freight Line Road one final time. The abandoned switching tower was slated for demolition next month. Budget approved. Safety hazard mitigation cited. She stood at its base and looked up. In 2014, warnings were filed and ignored. In 2018, warnings were forced. In 2026, reform moved, reluctantly but visibly. She considered what had truly prevented catastrophe. Not the arrests alone, not the trial, not even the exposure. It was the reinstatement of routine, inspection, maintenance, accountability embedded before failure. Red works when it is respected early. Yellow works when it is monitored honestly. Green works when movement follows structure. The trio believed disruption was the catalyst, but the real safeguard was duller. Less dramatic, less viral. Attention before impact. Her radio crackled softly. Routine dispatch update. All corridors clear. She looked once more at the dead signals along the abandoned tracks. Frozen, red, meaningless now. In abandoned systems, signals fade into relics. In active systems, they require discipline. As she turned toward her vehicle, she allowed herself one final, measured conclusion. You can arrest red. You can contain green. You can remove yellow. But if attention disappears, signals don't fail loudly. They fail quietly. And by the time anyone notices, stop no longer means stop. Go no longer means safe. And inevitability is no longer theoretical. It's on the rails. If you follow investigations where structure hides beneath spectacle, stay with the next case. Because the loudest failure isn't always the first sign of collapse.